And welcome to this session. I've got the wonderful Jayne Buckley from JB Therapy Services, who is a counsellor and psychotherapist, but she is also a workplace counsellor. And because of her background, having been in business all of her life, well, you know, not when she was little, obviously she went to school like everybody else, but she was in business running a print company before that. So everything she does within the workplace, she's always got a really good mind to helping the business. You know, as much as her focus is around any client that she's working with, it's very much business based. And today we are going to be talking about upgrading your communication skills. Welcome, Jayne.
Hello, welcome to everybody. Good to be here.
Really good to be here because I think this is something that I know that you've got lots of tips for us to take away. This is a really practical session that can change the way that you communicate with people. We very rarely think, don't we, about how we communicate. We think it's something that we've just grown up with and learned, but there's so many simple things that you can do to communicate better. And what do you think, you know, as far as communicating is concerned, both parties would get so much more out of their communication, wouldn't they, if it's done well?
Absolutely, without a doubt. And there's a model that I'll go through a little bit later on, which will help explain where we flit between and where we can actually get the really magical communication going.
And I know you're going to be touching on listening as well. And I'm a qualified coach, and I think that's one of the toughest things I had to learn while I was qualifying was listening. It's not just all about talking.
Absolutely, there is a skill to listening.
As you can see, I'm interrupting you already. Listening is one of the kindest things you can do to somebody, isn't it? And it's quite simple, but not many people do it well. So that's something we're going to be touching on. So Jayne, I will leave you to introduce what you're going to talk about today.
Okay, so one of the big things that came up for me in terms of the communication skills was, got to get this 100% right, but I know what I'm like. I do tend to go off at a tangent sometimes. So I have my trusty cards here, so bear with me if I ever need to look down, but I want to try to get this across as succinctly as I possibly can, because obviously it's difficult on a recorded session to not have any interaction. So, you know, forgive me if I go off too much of a tangent, but I'm sure you'll pull me back in.
I'll interact with you, Jayne.
Okay. One of the big things that came up for me when we first discussed this was, oh my word, it's professional, and my perceptual barriers came up in terms of what on earth can I say for in the workplace when you've got really you know, professional people doing a job where they're doing it all day every day, whether that be contracts, talking to clients or whatever else. And then it was like, okay, take a step back, Jayne, breathe, and let's just think about this from the basics in terms of our personal interactions with people, which is something that has changed quite a lot over the last 18 months because we've not physically been in the room with people so often. And that's had a big effect. So for some people, they found that it's been really easy to communicate online and Teams and what have you. And for others, it's been really difficult.
Yeah.
You know, for myself as a therapist, and I know with a lot of my other colleagues, it was how are we going to keep people safe? How are we going to be able to look at all their body language and everything else? But it's amazing the way that you can adapt, and if you tune into things, it can still be a really effective form of communication.
Actually, that brings up a really interesting point. I wonder if there's anyone researching the different things that are going on with us now, because we've had so much communication online, because you and I both know that a lot of our understanding of people comes from body language, doesn't it? And we just, as you say, we haven't had those clues and tips and those subconscious things that we're thinking happening, have we? I wonder how it's changed our brains and how we work as far as communication is concerned.
Well, what I've noticed particularly is in single sessions that you come away so much more tired at times than you would from a normal session, because you're really focusing in to try and get all of those cues from people that you would normally be able to sort of sit back a little bit and just watch what's going on in the whole room. So it's been quite interesting from my point of view, I have to say.
Really different, really different.
And it would be quite good, I think, for anyone that's watching this to just take a few moments to sort of reflect back for 5 minutes or so and just see whether that has brought up any changes for us, how that sits with you, how that feels, what's it done for you over the last few months.
I know that I definitely, I think we all talk in sort of the first lockdown, second lockdown, third lockdown, don't we? First lockdown, I spent a lot of time just showing people how to get onto Zoom. You know, I'd use Zoom in my coaching world for ages, and suddenly Zoom was a new thing for everybody. And so I think we were all embracing it with quite a lot of excitement at that point, because it was something so new and people realised they could save time. Whereas I think by second and third, there was Zoom lethargy had definitely set in, hadn't it? And as you say, we're using a lot more other skills when you're on Zoom. And so it is extremely tiring, you know, and you don't get the same feel-good factor from Zoom as you do. Everything's very productive. There's not the chat pre-meeting, the chat post-meeting, the coffee, the tea, the biscuits. You know, still managed to find my own biscuits, you know, it is, and also I think people have fitted a lot more meetings into a day, haven't they?
Yeah.
So
yeah, there's been this real, you know, well, you know, you finish that meeting, you've not got to go anywhere, so let's start the next one 5 minutes later and the next one 5 minutes later. But actually,
so in a way, we're going to enjoy the joys of coming back out into the world and the joys of communicating really well with people and seeing real life people.
Yeah, absolutely. But on the point of sort of self-care as well, within, as this is a wellbeing platform, what I've physically noticed as well is that my eyes are taking longer to readjust when I come away from sessions so much. It's about, you know, you can sit still for so long that you would never do, even from getting up and, you know, people coming into the meeting, getting up, shaking hands and all of that sort of stuff. Before you know it, you can have done 6 hours of sitting still and not done anything.
On that note, Jane, I've just bought myself a standing desk converter, because you do just feel like you've spent so much time at the desk in the last year and a half. So that's another wellbeing trick that I've wanted to test. So I'm just starting out. I keep forgetting, obviously.
Let me know what that goes like. Mind you, with my technology skills, you'll just see the middle part of me, because
start standing up doing therapy sessions.
I'm one of those ones that even though we've had 15 months of technology, I'll still be the one that's being told you're on mute.
Well, hopefully you're doing very well this morning.
Okay, so what I thought we could start off with just a quick question to all ask ourselves is, what would your colleagues or your partner, your significant other, actually say about your communication skills? How would they describe your communication skills? So I'd like people to sort of just take 5 minutes, reflect back, notebook in hand if possible, and just think about it. And as you're doing that, actually take notice of what's happening for you. I know sometimes with therapists it can seem a bit frou-frou and, oh, here we go, feelings and sensations and all of that. But that is our way of our body communicating with us of things that are going on underlying. And then when you've done that, perhaps, you know, think about how you feel about their communication skills as well and see what can be done there, because the key is to sort of seeing where things can change and then bringing about those change using the 5 sort of key skills that I'm going to go through. Okay, so if we go back to basics, communication really is, you know, the transference of information between 2 or more people effectively. And if we're all there at the meeting with our A game, then that's great. And, you know, it's far more likely to be a good, effective communication. But if somebody isn't actually, you know, fully committed because of anything else that might be going on in their life, then it's quite difficult sometimes to understand why things are being miscommunicated. You know, I'm saying what I'm saying. Why aren't people listening or hearing what it is? So if you start to see that sort of thing happening, you know, take stock, ask that question, you know, you okay? How's it going? You know, just to bring some of those human elements back in again. So if we start to look at what I said, the 5 sort of basics of communication, the first one, listening, or as we say, active listening. You know, we all think that we're listening, but how many of us have sat there and somebody's started to talk and they bring up something and already you're thinking of the answer? Oh, I'm going to say that, I'm going to say that. Well, as soon as you've started to do that, you've stopped listening. So you've not heard the rest of what somebody else is saying.
I think we all do that all the time, don't we?
And it's one of the,
you know, quickly, oh, I want to get out what I'm going to say, and you're not listening to the rest of it.
Absolutely. And it's one of the key skills that we learn as we go through our counselling training, is how to actively listen. And not only do we not hear the rest of the sentence, but the person that's talking to us picks up on those cues. You know, they can see when you're not listening because your eyes might wander, you know, you might be looking a bit complex or whatever else. And they're just going to think that you're disinterested, you're not bothered. And of course, that can already have an impact on the communication that's going to go on, without a doubt. Okay. Yeah. So the next one is the verbal communication. So the language that we use, which is so important. Not only do we not need to necessarily use lots of psychobabble on my part, everything has to be very clear and simple. That's the way I like it. But also in technical terms. Now, I know if we're talking to professionals, there are obviously some terms that happen, you know, that are industry standards, so that's fine. But we need to be very aware also with colleagues and things that we're using the correct language and that we're going to be understood. You know, some of these big companies have got a big hierarchy and not necessarily everybody is going to understand some of what we're saying. The other thing that we need to really think about is, as we're communicating, the inner language that's going on in us. So inner critic normally, because it tends to be far more critical than it is in terms of coachy. Although from your point of view, that's obviously where you come from. I tend to deal more with the self-critical side of it.
Well, you know, I think we're all, you know, we are all much more critical of ourselves than we are anybody else. And a lot of what we're talking about is just the mindfulness, isn't it? And being aware, absolutely, as you say, being aware of what's happening with you. And we definitely are very, very critical of ourselves internally.
Absolutely, without a doubt. And what we have to remember also is that our subconscious brain can't understand the nuances of when we're joking or when we're this or anything else. It just hears what it hears. And before long, if you have that pattern that keeps going on, that's where our limiting beliefs come in and everything else. But here I go off on a tangent.
You've just reminded me of something that sometimes we say as jokes things to friends and family, particularly family, I think, and maybe even our children. I was talking to somebody the other day and they were saying something that their dad had said as a joke again and again and again. And it was funny. It was funny. But you could see it had a little bit of an effect on the son. And it did make me reflect of maybe things that I've said to my boys as jokes. You know, we like to put people into their pigeonholes, don't we? Of like, you're like this and you're like that. And that kind of carries on, doesn't it? And again, it's the communication thing. And I don't want him to feel like that. And I sort of thought, oh, we've kind of put him in that pigeonhole. And maybe I've communicated that as a joke that I thought, but maybe that's not how it's been taken. So that's a really good point. I like that one.
I mean, fundamentally, that's actually where all of psychotherapy comes into play. You know, I know people have this sort of concept sometimes that, oh, they always want, I only wanted to go in and talk about this, but they always want to go back. But it's the things that we're brought up with when we're children that become our core beliefs. So we do have to be careful. And unfortunately, that biggest role of being a parent doesn't come with a handbook.
No. And, you know, my method of communication is when I like somebody, and this is me not in coach mode, this is me in my mode, when I take the mickey out of somebody or joke with somebody, it's because I like them. And that's my method of communication. Now, sometimes I'd like to think I'm aware enough to not do that if I feel it's affecting somebody negatively, but that might not be someone's cup of tea, mightn't it? And they might be misinterpreting what I'm, you know, something that I've taken the mickey out of they could take quite personally, couldn't they? And, you know, it's things like that, that you've just got different styles of communication. Yeah. Some people get that, totally get where I'm coming from, and they take it much as I would. If somebody took the mickey out of me, I'd like it. And I'd take that as a way that someone's being friendly with me, whereas that's not everybody, is it?
No, absolutely not. And the even more confusingly is sometimes there can be a relationship where you know people really quite well and you've said more or less the same thing before and it's been fine, but then you say it this time, or a version of, and this has such an adverse reaction. It's like, oh my word, what's happened there? But we have to be really mindful that, you know, anything else could be happening in someone's background and what's going on that day. Yes. And everything else. So yeah, which comes to the third one, which is the non-verbal cues as well. So, you know, before we've even started to communicate, people will have had some sort of expectation or made some sort of judgment on us. And then throughout all communication, when someone's talking to us, it's the way that we're sitting, the way that we're listening. And it all comes down to sort of the active listening skills as well. I'm very aware that I tend to throw my hands around an awful lot when I'm trying to explain things to people. But, you know, some people would find that really confusing and off-putting. So it's about being aware of all of those things, body language, facial expressions. And as I said, there's so much more focus online because we're having to really, really concentrate. Whereas if you had a big meeting sometimes in person, you know, you have that time to be able to sort of sit back and gaze around the room a little bit and study everybody else. We don't manage to get that on the great big Teams meetings.
It just reminded me actually of an experience, and it was only because I'd done coaching that I turned it around. So I was talking to somebody, and quite often while they were, this wasn't in a coaching session, this was in an interview type session. And while they were talking and I was talking, they were looking away from me a lot and not making, excuse me, not making good eye contact. Most of the meeting they were, but at certain points they weren't. And I knew, I started to take slight affront to it, which of course, you know, you've got to be mindful of your reaction to somebody else's body language. And then I realized it was when they were thinking, because we also know that sometimes, especially if you're like me and Jane and you're quite distracting while you're talking, sometimes people have to shut down one of the senses, don't they, to be able to concentrate. And I realized that when he looked away, when he came back, he said something really important. So it was his thinking time, that he just had to shut away the visual and go somewhere else. And maybe he was thinking about a past experience or something like that. As we know, the eyes go everywhere, don't they? But actually, my initial non-coach reaction was like, not mad keen that he's not making eye contact with, or he looks like he's not concentrating on what I'm saying. Yeah. Actually, he was concentrating much harder on what I was saying.
I mean, I actually do say in the therapy room at times that, you know, if there's a pause after you've been speaking, I'm not ignoring you. I'm literally processing, because I've listened to what you've said. So I'm processing it. And then I'm starting to pick out the things that I want to respond to. Yes. Quite often it's interesting as well when I have, because I see a lot of adolescent children or even younger children down to 5, unfortunately. But sometimes, obviously, when they're in the room with their mum, they may be sort of doodling, or they'll be looking the other way, or they'll be rocking or something. And the mum or the dad, sexist of me, wasn't it? A bit judgmental. But the parent would be there. It's like, stop doing that. Stop doing that. No, don't do this. Sit still. But actually, it's the way of somebody being able to process something. So yeah. I have no problem with that going on in the room. I really don't.
And I'm obviously within Inspire and spending time with you, Jane. I spend a lot of time with therapists, and they are not, and again, this is something I had to learn with coaching, even though I have to say it's a good tool for negotiation as well within the business environment and business meeting, the power of silence and being relaxed to let that silence sit there and let people think, and then let people answer. And it's a little bit similar to the active listening, isn't it? I personally don't always feel comfortable with the silence. I've really had to work on that. And that's why I'm a coach, not a therapist. But that, and I know very good businessmen who use that as a very important tool in the communication, the power of the pause and letting someone sit with what you've said. And whereas somebody like me, oh, we've got to fill that gap,
Well, I mean, that tends to come over, especially when it's when somebody's a people pleaser, and you know, they just want to make sure that they're giving and giving and giving. We tend to sort of fill that gap. But absolutely, is another skill that we learn is to have that pause. And in fact, there is one type of modality of therapy, which is the person-centered therapy. And I remember somebody saying to me that they had one session where there was nothing spoken at all. Now, personally, for me, that wouldn't work. My job is to make somebody feel comfortable when they come in.
Wow, and people pay money for that.
Well, you know, that's not necessarily my style. I want people to come in, but it is about giving people the space and time to reflect back, because quite often we don't get that in our busy lives. We don't have that opportunity. So, which leads well on to actually the emotional awareness, because that's very important within our communication skills. You know, it's an intuitive thing. Some people are more empathetic than others. You know, it's just something that we have. And within the professional scenario, sometimes things are so busy and it's so, you know, we're so mindful of just getting things done that can be one of the first things that goes out of the window. But we do need to be very aware of it, even more so now in terms of neurodiversity and stuff, and being aware of what people pick up on, whether they can read body language or whether they really do just hear what you say and it's really factual, that's what they're going to action. It's just having a bit of an awareness of what's going on and thinking about the recipient, who you are talking to, how they're going to receive it, not just what you want to say, really. Okay. And then there is the written word. Now, obviously, in our professional lives, we like to think that we've got really clear communication, legal documents or whatever it might be, contracts and things. But that aside, there is still a lot of communication that goes on to colleagues and in our personal life, you know, to our partners and children and things like that. And actually, sometimes now, because we've spent so much time isolating and we use our computers so much more, we tend to bash out the odd email here and there without really too much thought about what's going on for the other person. Then add into that.
Jayne, this brings up maybe we need a whole session on modern written communication, because oh my goodness, everybody has had the experience of a text going wrong, an email being misunderstood, you know. But it has definitely changed the way people communicate, hasn't it? Without doubt. I am very much one of, if a communication sounds like it's going off track and you know someone's getting a bit funny, straight away I pick up the phone and then it's all fine, because it can so easily be misread, the written word, can't it?
Well, we know what tone we're putting into it. We know what we mean by it and we understand what we're saying. But we have to remember that that person might pick the phone up, you know, 10 minutes, 2 hours later, and they may just have had a row with someone really important to them, and they're going to be really miffed with what you've put on there, you know. And don't get me started on the social media and the you know, the platforms, in terms of there's a whole new language that's coming out that may or may not be appropriate within a workplace.
Can you remember, I remember a friend reading a text, you know, and we must have all had this, you know, when someone goes, well, listen to what they said, and they read the text to you and they read it in a tone, and you think to yourself, I wonder if the person writing it actually wrote it in that tone. You know, it's a little bit like you know, NLP talk a lot about telepathy, and you know, you've just made up a whole load of things to the tone of a written email or text, because you're imagining it's like that and you've taken it like that. I know definitely I've sometimes taken a text like that, and then when I've reread it, I've thought to myself, actually it wasn't in that way. You know, it's just the slowing the process down, isn't it? But modern written communication can be very tricky.
I do so much on that, especially with the adolescents, because obviously they are instant. They want instant gratification, and yeah, so we
or
do
instant
that
route
work of absolute, you know, but so I spend my whole time going, but what if what if look at someone else's perspective, because that's the thing, we all have a different perspective depending upon what's happening for us at that time and what's happened to us in the past. So, and the other thing as well is that we can have a tendency to become keyboard warriors because we're hiding behind the keyboard. So we can be a lot more critical perhaps than we would be if we were face to face with somebody. We don't do the preliminary, hi, how are you, before we ask them to do something. And one of the most difficult times with this in organisations I've noticed, and I've been guilty of it myself as well, you've got your whole pile of stuff just before you're going off on annual leave. Quick, type it out, get rid of that, not having any real concept of what it's going to be like for all of this stuff turning up on someone else's inbox, and they're going to be literally sitting there thinking, well, hang on a minute, just because you're going off on holiday, I've now got your workload. So we do have to be quite mindful.
It's a minefield, and that I think probably we will do a separate session on that, because it's so easy for people to, you know, I've known people to say to me, you know, that they've had massive fallings out and they've never like verbally in person talked about it before. It's all been done over text, and it's so easy to misunderstand. And at the end of the day, why does anybody want to feel unhappy about communication? You know, I'm an absolute believer that if with talk, you can sort anything out. You know, it's just a question of talking and trying to understand. You get more understanding from trying to understand where the other person is coming from. Whereas if you're going out of your way to misunderstand how a written text has come to you, you know, 9 times out of 10, the person doesn't mean it like that.
No, the only thing I would say to that is, and it's great, but you have to, again, be quite mindful that the person that you're talking to may not be ready to have that conversation yet. So, you know, for instance, in your scenario, pick up the phone, but if they are angry about something, just, you know, I can sense it. I know that this is the case. When would be a good time for us to be able to talk about it? Because it's making me uncomfortable. You need to give the person the time to be able to sort of calm down a little bit and sort out. So one of the things that I thought I would share, just to see whether we could shed some light on why people can sometimes seemingly act out of context or out of character or whatever else, without getting too therapy on it. There's a model that we call the PAC model, who was Eric Byrne, who was a psychiatrist in the USA. And in 1958, I think it was, he came up with this PAC model, which is parent, adult, child. Now, within all of us, we have got these ego states that we call them parent, adult, child. And this is when my hands will go all over the place, because we think about it in terms of a line. So in terms of parent, actually this whole thing is called transactional analysis, so TA. And what that means is the transaction of communication and behaviours between people. That's what he's looking at and studying. So he realised that we all had these ego states within us. And then within parent, there were 2 parents. So there's critical and then there's nurturing. So I guess you can probably understand where that's coming from. We learn our core beliefs and a lot of our behaviours from the caregivers as we were growing up, and especially between the ages of 0 to 8. What we are surrounded by at that point really does make us into the type of person that we are later on in life. Then we have the adult, which is dealing with about thoughts, feelings and behaviours in the here and now. Okay, this is where, if we can get both people talking in adult mode, this is where the magic happens and good communication happens. And then we have child, and that is adaptive and what's the other, free, they class it as adaptive and free. Some models may say different words, but basically what that means is that the adaptive child is somebody in their childhood has had to find their own ways of coping with emotional situations and things. So that could be by being either really extrovert or being really introvert, or any of those sorts of things where they've had emotional issues to deal with. And then the fun-loving, free-spirited is the bit that's in all of us, that's lovely, that we enjoy dipping into. But if you think about the fact that we can all flip between all of these different stages, depending upon who we're talking to, it gives just a little bit of insight as to why you might get some of the results that you get sometimes. And I want to just share one thing on a professional level of where I was working in a company, and there had been a miscommunication that had left both people feeling really quite upset, because their intention had been totally and utterly misunderstood. So there was a boss who was trying to communicate to a much younger person that you know, they cared. This person had decided that it was time to move on. So the boss went up into parent mode, nurturing, trying to do that, you know, are you sure about this, and are you okay, and all of those sorts of things, with the very best of intentions. What happened was a really adverse reaction from the younger person, and I'm not saying that they were a child, but the younger person in the hierarchy in the business. That communication style threw them straight into their adaptive child mode. And then what came out of that on further communication with them when I was talking to them was that through their upbringing, they'd had a very difficult relationship with their father, who was very, very critical and was always trying to tell him what to do, etc., etc. And that nurturing communication style that had come from the top clicks straight down into, I don't need another dad. My dad's not much good anyway. I don't need another father. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. And it just goes to illustrate how complex we all are as humans. Although I do think a lot of the answers are simple, i.e. listening, being aware, but we are complex, and we so often just think about what's going on inside of us. And today's discussion has hopefully awakened your observational skills of what is happening with everyone else around you. And none of us are perfect. We all get this, you know, wrong, and you aren't supposed to know everything that's gone on in someone else's life. But this awareness, and hopefully what we've brought to you today, that just maybe just tweaking your mind to you watching somebody react to something you say, and you suddenly think you might not know what triggered it, and you might not, it might not be appropriate for you to know what triggered it. But even just knowing that you've triggered something, and it's something in the other person, not something inside you, is a really worthwhile tip to know, isn't it?
Absolutely. And in fact, that is one of the tips that I've got here. So, you know, if
we go to the top tips?
Let's go to the top. I mean, when you first said to me about doing something like this and half an hour more or less to talk on communications, it's like, oh my goodness, what on earth am I going to say for half an hour? But actually it is so long. There is so much that you could go into. So much, even just on a personal level, really. So I have 5 top tips.
Lovely.
Okay, if I have to say that. Number 1 goes back to the active listening. Make sure that the other person is aware that you are listening, and a lot of that is, you know, communication with your facial expressions, tipping your head, tipping into somebody, all of those things that prove that you are actively listening. If it's within a business environment, or even if it's a tricky conversation personally, have a pen and paper with you. And then, you know, we can all pick up a pen and just sort of write a word down to remind us once the person's finished about what we want to go back on. Really good top tip.
That's a very good tip. That's a very good tip.
Number 2 is to reflect and almost sort of paraphrase something that somebody has said to us, especially when they're asking us for information or asking us to do something. Say it back in your own words, because that shows that you've understood. And likewise, if you've been telling somebody else or asking somebody else to do a whole load of things, get them to just say back, okay, I know I've thrown a whole load of things at you. Do you want to just read back what you've heard and what I may have miscommunicated, and done it that way? Because then you can hear back what they said. It gives that opportunity to readjust, re-explain, redefine. That sort of thing. It also,
that's a really good tip in the workplace, especially if you've delegated a task to somebody. It's always a good tip to say, tell me what you tell me what you're going to do, or you know, you don't have to be really obvious about it. Just explain to me what you think I've said, because I might have, you know, I always do it in a sort of self-deprecating way, you know. So that's a very good work tip too.
Yeah, okay. And the other one is about apologising, you know, because we are all human, and the best way to get good communication and keep communication going is to apologise when necessary. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to continue to keep saying, oh, I'm sorry, and I'm sorry. And in fact, that's another whole session anyway. But there are good ways to be able to apologise. You know, when we don't, it stops other people wanting to talk to us anymore. And, you know, that can create a massive void in the workplace, especially, and at home anyway, without a doubt. So, you know, and the other thing I would say is don't apologise with a but, because you may as well not apologise, because you're then just rationalising.
So true.
Exactly.
So a veiled apology.
Exactly.
And then that just annoys somebody even more, and then the communication gets even worse.
Exactly. So you may as well have not even started. So just be sincere, take some responsibility, and, you know, instead of saying sorry, say something like, you know, it was wrong of me to just assume, or, you know, those sorts of things. So again, it comes down to the correct language that we use,
yes,
rather than constantly feeling as though we need to say sorry. The other thing as well is, the other top tip is to use I statements, rather than blame people and say, well, you did this and you did that. Go back to the real basics of, I feel unheard when you don't phone me because you're going to be late home, or I feel worried when you don't tell me you're going to be home late from work, rather than, God, it's so inconsiderate when you don't come in and I've cooked dinner, and, you know, all of those sorts of communication. And those are just as important within the workplace too, because when we say I, it stops somebody getting defensive, because if you start to blame somebody, human nature is they put their defences up.
Yeah. And as soon as the defences go up, the communication skills go down.
Exactly. People have stopped listening, they're thinking about their response, and communication's gone out the window.
Yeah, those little heckles on the back have got up.
That's the one. And then the final top tip for me would be, if something happens, be it through email, written communication, or even verbal with somebody, if you feel that need to respond, sit on your hands. Literally sit on your hands, because we have to learn not to react, to take some time, and to respond accordingly.
Very, very good tip. I have to say, I use that one, especially as I am Chief Happiness Officer. If I have reason to send an email that isn't quite as happy as one might have thought, I do write it, then leave it in drafts, and then you go back to it, and you always calm it down. I'm sure lots of people use that trick as well, or tip. Really good one.
Well, you'd be surprised how many people don't, because they, again, I'm talking about some of the younger people, or in their personal lives, we just, you know, fire off. We tend to be a lot more mindful at times in our professional life, because we know that there could be a consequence. We don't necessarily think about that quite so much in our personal life. Oh,
Jayne, you've given us some amazing tips, and real good take-home ones as well, that I'm sure people could come straight off of this. And I would say, you know, next time you're having a bit of a meaningful conversation, spend less time thinking about what you're saying and watch what's going on with the other person, because it is really amazing when you actually slow down and listen, and the results that you can get from it are brilliant. You know, that is one of our greatest things that we have between us as humans, is the ability to communicate well.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jayne. I'm sure there's going to be much more discussion with you and me about communication, both written and verbal, but thank you so much, Jayne. Thanks for joining us today.